Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back after a long time. It used to be Welcome Middle Earthers because I was going through the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. I've been out away for quite some time, and now I'm back. And Happy New Year. Today is the 6th of January, and 2021. Many are rejoicing at the end of 2020. I think the fun and games have just begun, but that's why I like to do this sort of activity, take my mind off things. So last year we were doing the Lord of the Rings. It was a nice bit of escapism during lockdown. Now the world is struggling to return to normal, although there are still lockdowns all over the place. And, well, frankly, I'm feeling a little more existential. The hope as expressed in the Lord of the Rings is not something that I gravitate to at this stage. I'm looking inward a little more, realizing that there's really very little that I can do to control events, but all I can focus on is controlling my emotions and how I respond to current events. Some of you would-be historians watching this in the future might recognize the date, the significance of January 6th, 2021, at least in American history. It's the day the Republicans lost the Senate, or I think so. I mean, it's after midnight on the early morning of the 6th, but it looks like that's what's going to happen. Perhaps by tomorrow I'll be saying something different because of some wild and crazy event, but who knows? I've decided to read this book by Hermann Hesse called Demian. It's a lot shorter than The Lord of the Rings. And this is for a good friend of mine, Paul, who is both a mentor and a friend and a fellow traveler. We have similar challenges in life, although he's quite a bit older. He doesn't have the best health, and so has been really relegated to his home property for much of the last year, and at least until a vaccine becomes widespread. And I know he's quite partial to Hesse, and so I figured I'd give it a read. There are other ones I'd like to read. Maybe we'll get through all of Hesse. I've never read this before, and so I'd like to give it a shot. And we'll start with the prologue, and I'm just going to skip the introduction. It's funny, I almost enjoy reading the introductions after reading the book. But, so yes, this book is called Demian, The Story of Emile Sinclair's Youth. Saturday Review calls this book a classic document of the revolt against the unreflected life. Now, I'm pronouncing it Demian, but maybe it's supposed to be pronounced Damian. So forgive me if I grate on your ears with any mispronunciations. But here we go. I cannot tell my story without reaching a long way back. If it were possible, I would reach back farther still, into the very first years of my childhood, and beyond them into distant ancestral past. Novelists, when they write novels, tend to take an almost godlike attitude toward their subject, pretending to a total comprehension of the story, a man's life, which they can therefore recount as God himself might, nothing standing between them and the naked truth, the entire story meaningful in every detail. I am as little able to do this as the novelist is, even though my story is more important to me than any novelist's is to him, for this is my story. It is the story of a man, not of an invented or possible or idealized or otherwise absent figure, but of a unique being of flesh and blood. Yet, what a real living human being is made of seems to be less understood today than at any time before, and men, each one of whom represents a unique and valuable experiment on the part of nature, are therefore shot wholesale nowadays. If we were not something more than unique human beings, if each one of us could really be done away with once and for all by a single bullet, storytelling would lose all purpose. But every man is more than just himself. He also represents the unique, the very special and always significant and remarkable point at which the world's phenomena intersect, only once in this way and never again. That is why every man's story is important, eternal, sacred. That is why every man, as long as he lives and fulfills the will of nature, is wondrous and worthy of every consideration. In each individual, the spirit has become flesh. In each man, the creation suffers. Within each one, a redeemer is nailed to the cross. Few people nowadays know what man is. Many sense this ignorance and die the more easily because of it, the same way that I will die more easily once I have completed this story. I do not consider myself less ignorant than most people. I have been and still am a seeker, but I have ceased to question stars and books. I have begun to listen to the teachings my blood whispers to me. My story is not a pleasant one. It is neither sweet nor harmonious, as invented stories are. It has the taste of nonsense and chaos, of madness and dreams, like the lives of all men who stop deceiving themselves. Each man's life represents a road toward himself, an attempt at such a road, the intimation of a path. No man has ever been entirely and completely himself, yet each one strives to become that, one in an awkward, the other in a more intelligent way, each as best he can. Each man carries the vestiges of his birth, the slime and eggshells of his primeval past, with him to the end of his days. Some never become human, remaining frog, lizard, ant. Some are human above the waist, fish below. Each represents a gamble on the part of nature and creation of the human. We all share the same origin, our mothers. All of us come in at the same door. But each of us, experiments of the depths, strives toward his own destiny. We can understand one another, but each of us is able to interpret himself to himself alone. Well, there's a lot there. Chapter 1. Two Realms. I shall begin my story with an experience I had when I was 10 and attended our small town's Latin school. The sweetness of many things from that time still stirs and touches me with melancholy. Dark and well-lighted alleys, houses and towers, chimes and faces, rooms rich and comfortable, warm and relaxed, rooms pregnant with secrets. Everything bears the scent of warm intimacy, servant girls, household remedies, and dried fruits. The realms of night and day, two different worlds coming from two opposite poles, mingled during this time. My parents' house made up one realm, yet its boundaries were even narrower, actually embracing only my parents themselves. This realm was familiar to me in almost every way. Mother and father, love and strictness, model behavior and school. It was a realm of brilliance, clarity and cleanliness, gentle conversations, washed hands, clean clothes, and good manners. This was the world in which morning hymns were sung and Christmas celebrated. Straight lines and paths led into the future. There was duty and guilt, bad conscience and confession, forgiveness and good resolutions, love, reverence, wisdom, and the words of the Bible. If one wanted an unsullied and orderly life, one made sure one was in league with this world. The other realm, however, overlapping half our house, was completely different. It smelled different, spoke a different language, promised and demanded different things. This second world contained servant girls and workmen, ghost stories, rumors of scandal. It was dominated by a loud mixture of horrendous, intriguing, frightful, mysterious things, including slaughterhouses and prisons, drunkards and screeching fishwives, calving cows, horses stinking to their death, tales of robberies, murders, and suicides. All these wild and cruel, attractive and hideous things surrounded us, could be found in the next alley, the next house. Policemen and tramps, drunkards who beat their wives, droves of young girls pouring out of factories at night, old women who put the hex on you so that you fell ill, thieves hiding in the forest, arsonists nabbed by country police. Everywhere this second vigorous world erupted and gave off its scent. Everywhere, that is, except in our parents' rooms. And that was good. It was wonderful that peace and orderliness, quiet and a good conscience, forgiveness and love ruled in this one realm, and it was wonderful that the rest existed too, the multitude of harsh noises, of sullenness and violence, from which one could still escape with a leap into one's mother's lap. It was strange how both realms bordered on each other, how close together they were. For example, when Lena, our servant girl, sat with us by the living room door at evening prayers and added her clear voice to the hymn, her washed hands folded on her smoothed down apron, she belonged with father and mother, to us, to those that dwelled in light and righteousness. But afterwards, in the kitchen or woodshed, when she told me the story of the, quote, tiny man with no head, or when she argued with neighborhood women in the butcher shop, she was someone else, belonged to another world which veiled her with mystery. And that's how it was with everything, most of all with myself. Unquestionably, I belonged to the realm of light and righteousness. I was my parents' child. But in whichever direction I turned, I perceived the other world, and I lived within that other world as well, though often a stranger to it, and suffering from panic and a bad conscience. There were times when I actually preferred living in the forbidden realm, and frequently returning to the realm of light, necessary and good as it may have been, seemed almost like returning to a less beautiful something rather drab and tedious. Sometimes I was absolutely certain that my destiny was to become like mother and father, as clear-sighted and unspoiled, as orderly and superior as they. But this goal seemed far away, and to reach it meant attending endless schools, studying, passing tests and examinations, and this way led past and through the other, darker realm. It was not at all impossible that one might remain a part of it and sink into it. There were stories of sons who had gone astray, stories I read with passion. These stories always pictured the homecoming as such a relief and as something so extraordinary that I felt convinced that this alone was the best, the sought-for thing. Still, the part of the story set among the evil and the lost was more appealing by far, and if I could have admitted it, at times I didn't want the prodigal son to repent and be found again. But one didn't dare think this, much less say it out loud. It was only present somehow as a premonition, a possibility at the root of one's consciousness. When I pictured the devil to myself, I could easily imagine him on the street below, disguised or undisguised, or at the country fair or in a bar, but never at home with us. My sisters, too, belonged to the realm of light. It often seemed to me that they had a greater natural affinity to my mother and father. They were better mannered, had fewer faults than I. They had their faults, of course, they had their bad moments, but these did not appear to go very deep as they did with me, whose contact with evil often grew so oppressive and painful, and to whom the dark world seemed so much closer. Sisters, like parents, were to be comforted and respected. If I had quarreled with them, I always reproached myself afterwards, felt like the instigator, the one who had to ask for forgiveness. For by offending my sisters, I offended my parents, all that was good and superior. There were secrets I would far rather have shared with the lowest hoodlum than with my sisters. On good days when my conscience did not trouble me, it was often delightful to play with them, to be good and decent as they were, and to see myself in a noble light. That's what it must have been like to be an angel. It was the highest state one could think of. But how infrequent such days were. Often at play, at some harmless activity, I became so fervent and headstrong that I was too much for my sisters. The quarrels and unhappiness this led to threw me into such a rage that I became horrible, did and said things so awful they seared my heart even as I said them. Then followed harsh hours of gloomy regret and contrition, the painful moment when I begged forgiveness to be followed again by beams of light, a quiet, thankful, undivided gladness. I attended the Latin school. The mayor's son and the head forester's son were in my class. They both visited me at home at times, and though they were quite unruly, they were good members of the legal world. Yet this did not mean that I had no dealings with some of the neighborhood boys who attended public school and on whom we usually looked down. It is with one of them that I must begin my story. One half holiday, I was little more than 10 years old, 2 neighborhood boys and I were roaming about when a much bigger boy, a strong and burly kid from public school, the tailor's son, joined us. His father drank and the whole family had a bad name. I had heard much about Franz Kromer, was afraid of him, didn't at all like that he came up to us. His manners were already those of a man, and he imitated the walk and speech of young factory workers. Under his leadership, we clambered down the riverbank by the bridge and hid below the first arch. The narrow strip between the vaulted wall of the bridge and the lazily flowing river was covered with nothing but refuse, shards, tangled bundles of rusty wire, and other rubbish. Occasionally one could pick up something useful there. Franz Kromer instructed us to comb the area and show him what we found. He would either pocket it or fling it into the river. He put us on the lookout for objects made of lead, brass, and tin, all of which he tucked away. Also an old comb made of horn. I felt very uneasy in his presence, not only because I knew that my father would not have approved of my being seen in his company, but because I was simply afraid of Franz himself, though I was glad that he seemed to accept me and treat me like the others. He gave instructions, and we obeyed. It seemed like an old habit, even though this was the first time I was with him. After a while we sat down. Franz spit into the water, and he looked like a man. He spit through a gap between his teeth and hit whatever he aimed at. A conversation started up, and the boys began boasting and heaping praise on themselves for all sorts of schoolboy heroics and tricks they had pulled. I kept quiet, and yet was afraid I'd be noticed, that my silence might particularly incur Kromer's wrath. My 2 friends had begun to shun me the very moment Franz Kromer had joined us. I was a stranger among them and felt that my manners and clothes presented a kind of challenge. As a Latin schoolboy, the spoiled son of a well-to-do father, it would be impossible for Franz to like me, and the other 2, I felt acutely, would soon disown and desert me. Finally, out of sheer nervousness, I began telling a story too. I invented a long tale about a robbery in which I filled the role of hero. In a garden near the mill, I said, together with a friend, I had stolen a whole sackful of apples one night, and by no means ordinary apples, but apples of the very best sort. It was the fear of the moment that made me seek refuge in this story. Inventing and telling stories came naturally to me. In order not to fall immediately silent again, and perhaps become involved in something worse, I gave a complete display of my narrative powers. One of us, I continued, had to stand guard while the other climbed the tree and shook out the apples. Moreover, the sack had grown so heavy that we had to open it again, leaving half the apples behind. But half an hour later we had returned and fetched the rest. When I had finished, I waited for approval of some sort. I had warmed to my subject toward the end and been carried away by my own eloquence. The 2 younger ones kept silent, waiting. But Franz Kromer looked sharply at me out of narrowed eyes and asked threateningly, "Is that true?" "Yes," I said. "Really and truly?" "Yes, really and truly," I insisted stubbornly while choking inwardly with fear. "Would you swear to it?" I became very afraid, but at once said yes. "Then say, 'By God and the grace of my soul.'" "By God and the grace of my soul," I said. "Well, all right," he said, and turned away. I thought everything was all right now and was glad when he got up and turned to go home. After we had climbed back up to the bridge, I said hesitantly that I would have to head for home myself. "You can't be in that much of a hurry," Franz laughed. "We're going in the same direction, aren't we?" Slowly he ambled on, and I didn't dare run off. He was in fact walking in the direction of my house. When we stood in front of it, and I saw the front door and the big brass knocker, the sun and the windows and the curtain in my mother's room, I breathed a sigh of relief. When I quickly opened the door and slipped in, reaching to slam it shut, Franz Kromer edged in behind me. In the cool tiled passageway, lit only by one window facing the courtyard, he stood beside me, held on to me, and said softly, "Don't be in such a rush, you." I looked at him, terrified. His grip on my arm was like a vice. I wondered what he might have in mind and whether he wanted to hurt me. I tried to decide whether if I screamed now, loud and piercingly, someone could come down from above quickly enough to save me. But I gave up the idea. "What is it?" I asked. "What do you want?" "Nothing much. I only wanted to ask you something. The others don't have to hear it." "Oh, really? I can't think of anything to say to you. I have to go up, you know." Softly, Franz Kromer asked, "You know who owns the orchard by the mill, don't you?" "I'm not sure. The miller, I think." Franz had put his arm around me, and now he drew me so close I was forced to look into his face inches away. His eyes were evil. He smiled maliciously. His face was filled with cruelty and a sense of power. "Well, I can tell you for certain whose orchard that is. I've known for some time that someone had stolen apples there, and that the man who owns it said he'd give 2 marks to anyone who'd tell him who swiped them." "Oh, my God!" I exclaimed. "You wouldn't do that, would you?" I felt it would be useless to appeal to his sense of honor. He came from the other world. Betrayal was no crime to him. I sensed this acutely. The people from the other world were not like us in these matters. "Not say anything," laughed Kromer. "Kid, what do you take me for? Do you think I own a mint? I'm poor. I don't have a wealthy father like you, and if I could earn 2 marks, I earn them any way I can. Maybe he'll even give me more." Suddenly he let go of me. The passageway no longer smelled of peace and safety. The world around me began to crumble. He would give me away to the police. I was a criminal. My father would be informed. Perhaps even the police would come. All the dread of chaos threatened me. Everything ugly and dangerous was united against me. It meant nothing that I'd filched nothing. I'd sworn I had. Tears welled up in my eyes. I felt I had to strike a bargain, and desperately I groped through all my pockets. Not a single apple, no pocket knife. I had nothing at all. I thought of my watch, an old silver watch that didn't work, that I wore just for the fun of it. It had been my grandmother's. Quickly, I took it off. I said, "Kromer, listen, don't give me away. It wouldn't be fair if you did. I'll give you my watch as a present. Here, take a look. Otherwise, I've nothing at all. You can have it. It's made of silver, and the works, well, there's something slightly wrong with them. You have to have it fixed." He smiled and waved the watch in his palm. I looked at his hand and felt how brutal and deeply hostile it was to me, how it reached for my life and peace. "It's made of silver," I said hesitantly. "I don't give a damn for your silver and your old watch," he said scornfully. "Get it fixed yourself." "But Franz," I exclaimed, trembling with fear that he might run away. Wait a moment. Why don't you take it? It's really made of silver, honest, and I don't have anything else." He threw me a cold, scornful look. "Well, you know who I'll go to. Or I could go to the police, too. I'm on good terms with the sergeant." He turned as if to go. I held on to his sleeve. I couldn't allow him to go. I would rather have died than suffer what might happen if he went off like that. "Franz," I implored, hoarse with excitement, "don't do anything foolish. You're only joking, aren't you?" "Yes, I'm joking. But it could turn into an expensive joke." "Just tell me what I'm supposed to do, Franz. I'll do anything you ask." He looked me up and down with narrowed eyes and laughed again. "Don't be so stupid," he said with false good humor. "You know as well as I that I'm in a position to earn 2 marks. I'm not a rich man who can afford to throw them away, but you're rich. You even have a watch. All you have to do is give me 2 marks. Then everything will be all right." I understood his logic, but 2 marks? That was as much and as unattainable as 10, as 100, as 1,000. I didn't have a pfennig. There was a piggy bank that my mother kept for me. When relatives came to visit, they would drop in 5 or 10 pfennig pieces. That was all I had. I had no allowance at that time. "I just don't have any," I said sadly. "I don't have any money at all. But I'll give you everything else I have. I have a western, tin soldiers, and a compass. Wait, I'll get them for you." Kromer's mouth merely twisted into a brief sneer. Then he spat on the floor. Harshly, he said, "You can keep your crap. A compass. Don't make me mad. You hear, I'm after money." "But I don't have any. I never get any. I can't help it." "All right. Then you'll bring me the 2 marks tomorrow. I'll wait for you after school down near the marketplace. That's all. You'll see what'll happen if you don't bring it." "But where am I going to get it if I don't have any?" "There's plenty of money in your house. There's your business. Tomorrow after school. And I'm telling you, if you don't have it with you." He threw me a withering look, spit once more, and vanished like a shadow. I couldn't even get upstairs. My life was wrecked. I thought of running away and never coming back, or of drowning myself. However, I couldn't picture any of this very clearly. In the dark, I sat down on the bottom step of our staircase, huddled up within myself, abandoning myself to misery. That's where Lena found me, weeping, as she came downstairs with the basket to fetch wood. I begged her not to say a word, then I went upstairs. To the right of the glass door hung my father's hat and my mother's parasol. They gave me a feeling of home and comfort, and my heart greeted them thankfully, as the prodigal son might greet the sight and smell of old familiar rooms. But all of it was lost to me now. All of it belonged to the clear, well-lighted world of my mother and father, and I, guilty and deeply engulfed in an alien world, was entangled in adventures and sin, threatened by an enemy, by dangers, fear, and shame. The hat and parasol, the old sandstone floor I was so fond of, the bright picture above the whole cupboard, the voice of my eldest sister coming to me from the living room were all more moving, more precious, more delicious than ever before, but they had ceased to be a refuge and something I could rely on. They had become an unmistakable reproach. None of this was mine anymore. I could no longer take part in its quiet cheerfulness. My feet had become muddied. I could not even wipe them clean on the mat. Everywhere I went, I was followed by a darkness of which this world of home knew nothing. How many secrets I had had, how often I had been afraid, but all of it had been child's play compared with what I brought home with me today. I was haunted by misfortune. It was reaching out toward me so that not even my mother could protect me, since she was not even allowed to know. Whether my crime was stealing or lying, hadn't I sworn a false oath by God, and everything that was sacred was immaterial. My sin was not specifically this or that, but consisted of having shaken hands with the devil. Why had I got along? Why had I obeyed Kromer better even than I had ever obeyed my father? Why had I invented the story, building myself up with a crime as though it were a heroic act? The devil held me in his clutches. The enemy was behind me. For the time being, I was not so much afraid of what would happen tomorrow as of the horrible certainty that my way from now on would lead farther and farther downhill into darkness. I felt acutely that new offenses were bound to grow out of this one offense, that my presence among my sisters, greeting and kissing my parents, were a lie, that I was living a lie concealed deep inside myself. For a moment, hope and confidence flickered up inside me as I gazed at my father's hat. I would tell him everything, would accept his verdict and his punishment, and would make him into my confessor and savior. It would only be a penance, the kind I had often done, a bitterly difficult hour, a ruefully difficult request for forgiveness. How sweet and tempting that sounded. But it was no use. I knew I couldn't do it. I knew I now had a secret, a sin which I would have to expiate alone. Perhaps I stood at the parting of the ways. Perhaps I would now belong among the wicked forever, share their secrets, depend on them, obey them, have to become one of their kind. I had acted the man and hero. Now I had to bear the consequences. I was glad when my father took me to task for my muddy boots. It diverted his attention by sidestepping the real issue and placed me in a position to endure reproaches that I could secretly transfer to the other, the more serious offense. A strange new feeling overcame me at this point, a feeling that stung pleasurably. I felt superior to my father. Momentarily I felt a certain loathing for his ignorance. His upbraiding me for muddy boots seemed pitiful. If only you knew, crossed my mind as I stood there like a criminal being cross-examined for a stolen loaf of bread when the actual crime was murder. It was an odious, hostile feeling, but it was strong and deeply attractive, and shackled me more than anything else to my secret and my guilt. I thought Kromer might have gone to the police by now and denounced me, that thunderstorms were forming above my head while all this time they continued to treat me like a little child. This moment was the most significant and lasting of the whole experience. It was the first rent in the holy image of my father. It was the first fissure in the columns that had upheld my childhood, which every individual must destroy before he can become himself. The inner, the essential line of our fate consists of such invisible experiences. Such fissures and rents grow together again, heal and are forgotten, but in the most secret recesses they continue to live and bleed. I immediately felt such dread of this new feeling that I could have fallen down before my father and kissed his feet to ask forgiveness. But one cannot apologize for something fundamental, and a child feels and knows this as well and as deeply as any sage. I felt the need to give some thought to my new situation, to reflect about what I would do tomorrow, but I did not find the time. All evening I was busy getting used to the changed atmosphere in our living room. Wall clock and table, Bible and mirror, bookcase and pictures on the wall were leaving me behind. I was forced to observe with a chill in my heart how my world, my good, happy, carefree life was becoming a part of the past, was breaking away from me, and I was forced to feel how I was being shackled and held fast with new roots to the outside, to the dark and alien world. For the first time in my life I tasted death, and death tasted bitter, for death is birth, is fear and dread of some terrible renewal. I was glad when I finally lay in my bed. Just before, as my last torment, I had had to endure evening prayers. We had sung a hymn which was one of my favorites. I felt unable to join in with, and every note galled me. When my father intoned the blessing, when he finished with God be with us, something broke inside me and I was rejected forever from this intimate circle. God's grace was with all of them, but it was no longer with me. Cold and deeply exhausted, I had left them. When I had lain in bed a while, enveloped by its warmth and safety, my fearful heart turned back once more in confusion and hovered anxiously above what was now past. My mother had said good night to me, as always. I could still hear her steps resound in the other room. The candle glow still illuminated the chink in the door. Now, I thought, now she'll come back once more. She has sensed something. She will give me a kiss and ask kindly with a promise in her voice, and then I'll weep. Then the lump in my throat will melt, then I will throw my arms around her, and then all will be well. I will be saved. And even after the chink in the door had gone dark, I continued to listen and was certain that it simply would have to happen. Then I returned to my difficulties and looked to my enemy in the eye. I could see him clearly, one eye screwed up, his mouth twisted into a brutal smile. and while I eyed him, becoming more and more convinced of the inevitable, he grew bigger and uglier, and his evil eye lit up with a fiendish glint. He was right next to me until I fell asleep, yet I didn't dream of him, nor of what had happened that day. I dreamed instead that my parents, my sisters, and I were drifting in a boat, surrounded by absolute peace and the glow of a holiday. In the middle of the night I woke with the aftertaste of this happiness. I could still see my sisters' white summer dresses shimmer in the sun as I fell out of paradise back into reality, again face to face with the enemy with his evil eye. Next morning, when my mother came rushing up shouting that it was late and why was I still in bed, I looked sick. When she asked me whether anything was wrong, I vomited. This seemed to be something gained. I loved being slightly sick, being allowed to lie in bed all morning, drinking chamomile tea, listening to my mother tidy up the other rooms, or Lina deal with the butcher in the hallway. Mornings off from school seemed enchanted, like a fairy tale. The sun playing in the room was not the same sun shut out of school when the green shades were lowered. Yet even this gave me no pleasure today. There was something false about it. If only I could die. But as often before, I was only slightly unwell, and it was of no help. My illness protected me from school, but not from Franz Kromer, who would be waiting for me at 11 in the marketplace. And my mother's friendliness, instead of comforting me, was a distressing nuisance. I made a show of having fallen asleep again in order to be left alone to think, but I could see no way out. At 11, I had to be at the market. At 10, I quietly got dressed and said that I felt better. The answer, as usual under these circumstances, was either I went straight back to bed or in the afternoon I would have to be in school. I said I would gladly go to school. I had come up with a plan. I couldn't meet Kromer penniless. I had to get hold of my piggy bank. I knew it didn't contain enough, by no means enough, yet it was something, and I sensed that something was better than nothing and that Kromer could at least be appeased. In stocking feet, I crept guiltily into my mother's room and took the piggy bank out of her desk. Yet that was not half as bad as what had happened the day before with Kromer. My heart beat so rapidly I felt I would choke. It did not ease up when I discovered downstairs that the bank was locked. Forcing it was easy. It was merely a matter of tearing the thin tin plate grid, yet breaking it hurt. Only now had I really committed a theft. Until then I had filched lumps of sugar or some fruit. This was more serious stealing, even though it was my own money I stole. I sensed how I was one step nearer Kromer in his world, how bit by bit everything was going downhill with me. I began to feel stubborn. Let the devil take the hindmost. There was no turning back now. Nervously I counted the money. In the piggy bank it had sounded like so much more, but there was painfully little lying in my hand. 65 pfennigs. I hid the box on the ground floor, held the money clasped in my fist, and stepped out of the house feeling more different than I had ever felt before when I walked through the gate. I thought I heard someone calling after me from upstairs, but I walked away quickly. There was still a lot of time left. By a very devious route, I sneaked through the little alleys of a changed town, under a cloudy sky such as I had never seen before, past staring houses and people who eyed me with suspicion. Then it occurred to me that a friend from school had once found a thaler in the cattle market. I would gladly have gone down on my knees and prayed that God perform a miracle and let me make a similar find, but I had forfeited the right to pray. And in any case, mending the box would have required a second miracle. Franz Kromer spotted me from a distance, yet he approached me without haste and seemed to ignore me. When he was close, he motioned authoritatively for me to follow him, and without once turning back, he walked calmly down the Strohgasse and across the little footbridge until he stopped in front of a new building at the outskirts. There were no workmen about. The walls were bare, doors and windows were blanks. Kromer took a look around, then walked through the entrance into the house, and I followed him. He stepped behind a wall, gave me a signal, and stretched out his hand. "Have you got it?" he asked coolly. I drew my clenched fist out of my pocket and emptied my money into his flat, outstretched palm. He had counted it even before the last pfennig piece had clinked down. "That's 65 pfennigs," he said, and looked at me. "Yes," I said nervously, "that's all I have. I know it's not enough, but it's all I have." "I thought you were cleverer than that," he scolded, almost mildly. "Among men of honor, you've got to do things right. I don't want to take anything away from you that isn't the right sum. You know that. Take your pennies back. There. The other one, you know who, won't try to scale down the price. He pays up." "But I simply don't have another pfennig. It's all I had in my bank." "That's your business. But I don't want to make you unhappy. You owe me 1 mark 35 pfennigs. When can I have them?" "Oh, you'll get them for sure, Kromer. I just don't know when right now. Perhaps I'll have more tomorrow or the day after. You understand, don't you, that I can't breathe a word about this to my father." "That's not my concern. I'm not out to do you any harm. I could have my money before lunch if I wanted, you know, and I'm poor. You wear expensive clothes and you're better fed than I. But I won't say anything. I can wait a bit. The day after tomorrow I'll whistle for you. You know what my whistle sounds like, don't you?" He let me hear it. I had heard it before. "Yes," I said, "I know it." He left me as though he had never seen me before. It had been a business transaction between the two of us, nothing more. I think Kromer's whistle would frighten me even today if I suddenly heard it again. From now on, I was to hear it repeatedly. It seemed to me I heard it all the time. There was not a single place, not a single game, no activity, no thought, which this whistle did not penetrate. The whistle that made me his slave, that had become my fate. Frequently I would go into our small flower garden, of which I was so fond on those mild, colorful autumn afternoons, and an odd urge prompted me to play once more the childish games of my earlier years. I was playing, so to speak, the part of someone younger than myself, someone still good and free, innocent and safe, yet into the midst of this haven, always expected, yet horribly surprising each time. From somewhere Kromer's whistle would erupt, destroying the game, crushing my illusions. Then I would have to leave the garden to follow my tormentor to wicked, ugly places where I would have to give him an account of my pitiful finances and let myself be pressed for payment. The entire episode lasted perhaps several weeks, yet to me they seemed like years, an eternity. Rarely did I have money, at most a 5 or 10 pfennig piece stolen from the kitchen table when Lena had left the shopping basket lying around. Kromer upbraided me each time, becoming more and more contemptuous. I was cheating him, depriving him of what was rightfully his. I was stealing from him, making him miserable. Never in my life had I felt so distressed. Never had I felt more hopeless, more enslaved. I had filled the piggy bank with play money and replaced it in my mother's desk. No one asked for it, but the possibility that they might never left my thoughts. What frightened me even more than Kromer's brutal whistling was my mother stepping up to me. Wasn't she coming to inquire about the piggy bank? Because I had met my tormentor many times empty-handed, he began finding other means of torturing and using me. I had to work for him. He had to run various errands for his father. I had to do them for him. Or he would ask me to perform some difficult feat, hop for 10 minutes on one leg, pin a scrap of paper on a passers-by coat. Many nights in my dreams I elaborated on these tortures and lay drenched in a nightmare sweat. For a while I actually became sick. I vomited frequently and came down with frequent chills, yet at night I would burn and sweat. My mother sensed that something was wrong and was very considerate, but this only tortured me the more since I could not respond by confiding in her. One night, after I had gone to bed, she brought me a piece of chocolate. It reminded me of former years when if I had been a good boy I would receive such rewards before I fell asleep. Now she stood there and offered me the piece of chocolate. The sight was so pitiful that I could only shake my head. She asked me what was wrong and stroked my hair. All I could answer was no, no, I don't want anything. She placed the chocolate on my night table and left. The next morning, when she wanted to ask me about my behavior the night before, I pretended to have forgotten the episode completely. Once she brought the doctor, who examined me and prescribed cold baths in the morning. My condition at that time was a kind of madness. Amid the ordered peace of our house, I lived shyly, in agony, like a ghost. I took no part in the life of the others, rarely forgot myself for an hour at a time. To my father, who was often irritated and asked me what was the matter, I was completely cold. And that is chapter 1. That was called Two Realms. Hope you enjoyed that. I'm enjoying it. I have no idea what this book is even about. So I enjoyed that. We'll continue next time with chapter 2, entitled Cain. That's ominous. Until next time.